I'm Steve Wiggins, and this is the Groundworks Ministries podcast. Today we're reading from the book of Genesis, chapter 28, and let's focus on verses 12 and 13. And he dreamed, a stairway to heaven was set on the ground with its top reaching to heaven, and God's angels were ascending and descending upon it. The Lord was standing there beside him, saying, I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham, and the God of Isaac. I will give you and your offspring the land that you are now sleeping on. Genesis 28, verses 12 and 13. Anyone who has been in a music store over the past 30 years is familiar with the opening melody of Led Zeppelin's Stairway to Heaven. And if you have ever been in a music store, you have no doubt been privy to countless bad renditions of it. Had we lived in the days of Jacob, perhaps the band would have written Ladder to Heaven, but I digress. The description of Jacob's dream is one of the most vivid biblical images of the Lord and his angels working on the face of the earth. It's like being privy to the whereabouts of that door where the Disney characters enter and exit at the theme park. And it should be noted that the angels are first mentioned as ascending the ladder, because that observation has caused some scholars to speculate that the angels had been accompanying Jacob on his journey the whole time. And only now were they returning to the Lord because the Lord had showed up. And maybe it was a shift change at heaven, and who knows. But the Bible doesn't say. It's safe to assume that Jacob was without any human friends, but unseen there had been angels by his side to protect and to encourage him. And isn't it comforting to know that the Lord has commanded his angels to watch over his children? Abraham is mentioned as Jacob's father because both Isaac's blessing and Esau's birthright now rested with Jacob. Jacob was the direct recipient and conduit of God's promises to Abraham. There's a great lesson concerning God's faithfulness here. God's guarantee of fulfilled promises was dependent upon God's character and not upon the character of the patriarchs. Jacob was a deceiver, and God would soon test Jacob's mettle, but the Lord knew what kind of man that Jacob would become once God's work in Jacob's life was completed. And I hope that you're encouraged by this truth. God's love for his children is great enough to lead us through hardships, just to mold us into inheritors who would live up to the character of his name. If you're suffering through a time of molding and stretching, well, then be encouraged. Asleep or awake, God himself, in addition to his angels, is ever present. God is personally there for us, those who are called his children. Perhaps then you're like, okay, hold on. Well, then how do I become one of God's children? Well, John 1:12 says this, but as many as received him, to them he gave the right to become children of God, to those who believe in his name. Or what about Hebrews chapter 13, verse 5, which says, for God has said, I will never leave you or forsake you. Are you concerned about whether or not the Lord will leave or forsake you? Well, perhaps you need to revisit the gospel. Perhaps you need to understand that our salvation is not from our works, but from his works. And not only are we saved by him, but we are kept by him. Jesus said in John chapter 10 that we are in his hand. And not only his hand, but we're also in the Father's hand. And before anybody could ask him, well, which is it, yours or the Father's? He says, for the Father and I are one. There is security in the promise of the Lord, even when we're undergoing the discipline of the Lord. Isn't it good to know that? If you don't know that you have eternal life, that you are saved, that you are truly one of God's children, well, why don't you check us out at groundworksministries.com. I'm Steve Wiggins, and this is the Groundworks Ministries podcast. Once again, check us out at groundworksministries.com.